Here's a higher family. Well, so we're coming on again tonight to provide a further repudiation of the Balfour Declaration. We have, as you recall, been looking at this letter of intent that we know was provided by the British Foreign Secretary in November of 1917 to a member of the Rothschild family, actually conveying an intention to assist them establish a homeland for the Jewish peoples there. So I've been looking really at we've not looked so much really at the actual history of this event and the actual events that led up to the provision of this letter. We will actually come on to do that subsequently, but we really have been exploring why, from our perspective as the actual true peoples and inheritors of that land of Israel is our heritage, why this presents a problem, and it's hugely problematic, not only in and of itself, but really just also by the sheer nature of what we've actually been discussing, about the fact that we've actually come to the end of a major cycle of history, essentially. As we have been explaining, we've just come through a major transitionary shift, as we know, in the earth. I know that many of us are actually aware the times are changing. And we can see also that it does, just by its very nature, require a change to be made in many areas and many things, because essentially it really does have ushered in a new order of things. So the actual traditional, the old methods or mechanisms by which we've been proceeding to date are no longer sufficient, really. We do now need to find a new way forward, and also now perhaps take a slight difference or variation in direction also, in order to be actually in the actual flow of what Yahuwah very much is doing at this time. So we have really given some actual context for explaining this in times past. I don't want to get too much into discussing that in this present video. I will come on in a subsequent video to elaborate further around all of that. But in this particular video, we're going to call it Maga, or the Maga agenda, and really explore as to why this letter of intent, well, is quite problematic and in many ways actually bears out some of the actual worst outworkings, not only of that Maga agenda, but of the overall, I guess, trajectory, really, of European Western civilizations, European nations, really, in relation to their their question as to how they actually have traditionally managed, I can only call it, our peoples. So, the Maga agenda. So, you may recall how this all really began. So we began back shortly after the actual election of Donald Trump in the US to office. Began to look at a specific executive order that he signed. So if you recall, he signed an executive order. I think it was called something along the lines of ending illegal discrimination and restoring merit-based opportunity, which is quite an interesting name, really, for this particular executive order, because he essentially revoked the requirement for federal contractors or those bidding for federal tenders to actually maintain desegregated facilities for their staff, if you will. So there was a whole question as to whether this would actually result in the introduction of segregation in some spheres. So these particular requirements had been on the statute books well since our forefathers, under people like Martin Luther King, actually fought to secure various civil rights, really, for their peoples in the US. So it led on to a major debate, really, around this overall agenda. Well, into several things. One was the actual, my surprise to some extent, that desegregation had just been signed off by an executive order, because I thought that was more a constitutional an issue that really should have actually been an amendment to their constitution in some actual way, as if the US was actually, I guess, designed essentially to accommodate our people. We know now that it's not essentially. it tells us so much, really. It's the way they actually brought that to pass. But the other aspect really was with regard to this overall agenda, because we can see the actual thrust of the issue was essentially to take America backward in time, essentially, to a time when it was deemed to be great. And for all intents and purposes, it was deemed to be great when Yasharel were at, well, one of her chief points of, suffering in a real sense, and were quite disadvantaged socially, really, in time, really being in the midst of the actual civil rights, the inception of the civil rights movement and that sort of era. So, I mean, we're based in the UK, but we can see really that a number of issues as regards to particularly relationships to and interactions with our peoples particularly, has been fairly universal. And it led to an actual wider review, well, of where this overall, idea was coming from. That there was an era in which America had been great, in which it had seen, well, in a period of inequality, really, in which our peoples were not, when it wasn't great for our peoples, put it that way, and where this whole agenda had come from. And we found, really, began to uncover that historically it's been a very, very long and far-reaching agenda that has even been implemented in previous generations with quite devastating effects as well. So why do we actually bring this whole topic up now? And why is it even important? Because many will say, oh, well, it was so long ago, we had to build Western civilization, we may have cracked a few eggs. People say this. Some people got hurt or got destroyed, but this was just overall, collateral damage, sort of get over it sort of thing. I have actually heard arguments like this raised as viable arguments. But we raise it because there's a very serious existential issue around all of this. Because as we have said, we have come to the end of a major cycle of history. I began to actually tell you that in 2020, I noted a number of indicators really aligning, that I did align that year, particularly to another year in the past. And which pointed to the fact that we had come to the end of a major cycle of history. And if that were the case, it would mean that we are actually on the cusp of reinitializing a new cycle of history. And of course, we know that the whole issue with history is that it is cyclical. It does repeat, or it can repeat, but if uninterrupted and if gone into blindly. So as we can see, we all know what the actual history meant for our peoples in the past 2,000 years, particularly in Europe, because we've come to understand that in 70 AD, when our forefathers actually lost Jerusalem and were driven out essentially into Europe, so a whole nation was driven out into Europe essentially. Those that didn't flee to the mountains as per Yeshua's instruction, that when they saw Jerusalem compassed with armies, they were to flee. So those who didn't take Yeshua's instruction to flee into Africa, because Africa has long been a mountain, a place where our people have always gone in to hide, due to our being of the same colour as the Africans, and the Shemites traditionally being brown, like the Africans. So those who didn't actually heed Yeshua's instruction to flee found themselves swept up into the actual captivity, essentially, that was driven into Europe. This would have been millions of people. And we actually looked at a 15th century artifact of Lisbon, Portugal, in the late 15th century. And there were images of our peoples absolutely everywhere in that painting, with actual understanding that that was a typical daily scene in Lisbon, Portugal, in the end of the 15th century. So where had all these people gone to? So I've come to understand the history, really, and to see the long and short of it, that essentially what we deem to be the transatlantic slave trade were actually transpired twice, in a real sense, because there was also an outward trade towards the late 15th century from Spain and Portugal, particularly, both back to the west coast of Africa, to Guinea and St. Principe, and St. Thomas and Principe, chiefly, and also towards the west to the New World as well, also, which is newly emerging, just opening up as a colony really for slaves at that particular time. So it was a period of prolific loss of life. And we really have looked into this and done a bit of a tribute, really, in our Maga series around this, to that generation, upon whom it must have seemed as though the whole Plymouth Rock, really, of the covenant, the curses of the covenant, it must have felt as though that really did land on that generation, who were decimated, really, by it, essentially. But the long and short of it was that at the end of it, Europe was totally restored to its whiteness, or looked as though it was white, as it had done before 70 AD, I suppose. And then they followed a period of iconoclasm in which most of our contributions were either whitewashed or removed, essentially. So we see that we went through the actual captivity, transatlantic slave trade, then ensued shortly after that. Well, actually it was an intervening trade also out to the east, by the Ishmaelites as well. So some of the people who were actually taken back to West Africa were then trafficked to the east as well. So, as we said, come to the end of this cycle of history, a reinitiation of a new cycle, and as we have seen, nothing has really been addressed or reckoned with at all. So, we know that, as I say, the adage says that those who don't learn the lessons from history can be doomed to repeat its mistakes if they're not careful. So this is that actual nature of the issue that we're actually raising. So, as we say, the actual nature of the issue was existential for that whole population that were in Europe, were, well, just totally decimated. And as I said, this would have been millions of people. And we begin to see the nature of some of the brutality they faced. For instance, we can see that even the early Christians, how many of them actually did perish in the Colosseum for sport, because Christianity wasn't very well accepted initially within Europe, because it was an ancient world that worshipped the Greek deities, essentially. At that time, the Romans worshipped the Greek deities. So we know the whole new nobility also, and throughout Europe, a black nobility at that time also. And we saw in Spain and Portugal, well, how many of them actually had to dispose of their estates, actually selling a whole workshop for a handkerchief and an estate for a loaf of bread. It really was, they had literally just gave away their properties and had to actually leave forcibly. So that whole nobility was never really restored at all. And we've even seen in recent times, when the US has actually been trying to elevate or raise brown peoples, we've seen very, very definitive attempts as well also within that constituency to actually pull them down. So we actually see the nature of this whole overall agenda and ultimately what its overall design really is. So, as I say, the actual Balfour Declaration of itself does represent some of the actual worst, to me, outworkings, really, of the overall discovery doctrine and this whole Maga agenda also. Because we actually did look into some of the actual attitudes of the actual day that we actually did identify in that 15th century artifact. So we looked at a 15th century painting of Lisbon, Portugal, and as we saw all the typical, well, some of the most negative and pejorative sort of statements we have heard about Yeshuite peoples over the years were really embodied really in that painting that we saw, even though it dates from the late 15th century. They were all quite clearly there. As we saw, front and centre in the portrait was a black-on-black crime scene. And also the dehumanization, also some of the ways that many of the Yeshuites were depicted, because they were just depicted as just black blobs, actually in black paint. Black blobs had no facial features or characteristics you could discern in many cases. So a little bit dehumanizing attitudes as well coming through there also. So we did a thorough analysis, really, a commentary, really, on the painting, the sort of things that we could actually see. But to see that from then, really, to now, some of these attitudes are a little less pronounced. They're still very much there. We still see them. They still do emerge from time to time. They're a little less pronounced because now, I think the issue is that more of us are actually integrated into their tabernacle systems. That's why they are being less vocal in saying some of the things we're actually saying. At the end of the day, ultimately, that's all it is. But nevertheless, the attitude is still very, very much there. So these systems, Psalm 83 verse 6 does tell us that Mystery Babylon is a tabernacle system, but they're also responsible for I guess, hiding or for concealing or for managing other agendas, really, around either the hegemony, the supremacy, whatever you want to call it, of Edom, essentially, by any means. So while you can say maybe there is, I wouldn't say an expectation, but while it may not be quite so surprising that that would be on the agenda, perhaps, of a group of people to do as part of a secret kind of mission that isn't really, overtly spoken of or known, the actual nature, really, by which they have achieved their means historically is alarming. Because as we saw in the actual instance of the removal of our forefathers from Spain and Portugal the first time, they actually instigated the Inquisitions to bring that about. Of course, now we have technology, so it will be considerably easier. But the actual nature of the actual reason why we're actually talking about it now is because it was essential to those people at that time, and it was a major population of people that were ultimately ended up being removed. And this was a genocide, essentially. There's no other way to call it. Really, that's essentially what it was. But if this were to occur again in any form, well, we don't really want to even think about it or even go there. So Yahuwah really is intervening, really, at this time to now actually pull his people out of this, and is part of the actual reason we have actually been giving scripture and verse, really, and prophetic words, really, around the need for there to be some separation, really, of our peoples, particularly from these systems, because as we already know, we have pre-existing covenants with the God of heaven that were conjoined to us by Moses, or to our forefathers by Moses. And so if you're putting yourself in another additional covenant to the opposite kingdom, well, you could be in some peril, as we have said. So Yahuwah is actually calling us now to repentance and to return to him, in a nutshell, is what he's actually requiring now. Because there is still yet a vision, as we have come to see, for the son of Jesse, or for Judah, the tribe of Judah. Yahuwah does still have a mission, a destiny for Israel that must also be brought to fruition and complete, even in order for him to return. So this also is something that which our enemies are also aware of. These systems also do actually do look out for as well. Those that may rise. So in my saying these things as well, I'd like to also really advise and admonish our peoples to be vigilant. Because we all now know the playbook. We've all seen this arise in previous generations to understand really how it goes. We've seen that, we've watched them really sideline and isolate people like myself who do actually speak out about things like this. And we know the drill now. We've seen it with a number of our leaders. So I mean, I personally, as I say, I live very, very quietly. The most I've ever had with the law is maybe the odd parking ticket. is kind of it. So if you hear any other rumours or scandals or slanders or imprecations or whatever associated to my name on account of my having said this, then you'll know it's just all a fabrication and it's part of the actual overall script that they can revert to when trying to discredit people who point out, factual things that they don't want to hear said. And that is unfortunate, really, because with the actual bringing in illumination and light, there's an actual chance to actually address various things and do something about them and move things positively forward. But in many cases, that's not what they hear. But anyway, we're not going to be daunted, and we're still going to continue to write a repudiation really of this letter of intent, this Balfour Declaration, that resulted in the gifting of our lands essentially to another people, who say that they are the people, and there was no sort of need, or not felt to be the need, even to verify whether that was actually the case at all, because the case of Israel was deemed to have been a done deal. And as you can see, they thought we wouldn't be leading our land from what they had actually done. And this is one of the reasons why Yahuwah is coming back with such judgment, because of course he's not in agreement with these things at all. And we looked at some of the issues that had gone on, transpired with Edom and Israel particularly, even when they were in the land, to understand that Yahuwah had to essentially administer a judgment and even drive them away from even living in the land in any association to Israel, because it was such a problematic. It was such a problem in those times. Yes, so as we say, the Maga agenda is still a very viable agenda. It is still in operation, and we don't want to see anything like a repeat of what has transpired against our people in the last 2,000 years. And really, on the basis of what has transpired in the history, it should actually be illegal and a crime for there to be any kind of racial discrimination at all, anywhere. Because that was the actual source of it. And even as I sit today and look at the news, in fact, sometimes I just try not to look, to be honest, because I see all the furore going on around migrant hotels. And I'm thinking, my gracious, we've literally come right round in a circle back to precisely where we were in 1492, because in that time also there was a similar situation of pogroms, violent riots breaking out against Jews as well. I believe in about the late or the mid 14th century, about 1341 or somewhere round about there, a major riot in Seville resulted in about 3,000 Jews perishing in one day. So currently the actual migrant hotel gatherings, people would say, well, they're very peaceable. They're not anything like what we saw, what I'm talking about, that happened in Seville, and that actually transpired throughout Europe, really, and then lately in Spain by the end of the 15th century. But they also had a peaceable start as well, until it escalated until it did then turn into violence. So we see very, very heavily here, again, a cycle of history, essentially, trying to repeat. And it's unfortunate, because ultimately we possibly have more in common than we do have a difference. But anyway, so Yahuwah, I said, with that in mind, is now intervening, really, to begin to, requires people to return to him, certainly, as the actual first step in also repudiating this Maga agenda. Because often we stand in the way of Yahuwah's judgment because we can join ourselves to our enemies and put ourselves in places and positions where we have no right or business really to be. And this really is a danger, really, to Israel. I've said repeatedly that eventually Yahuwah's judgment will be visited for it. And those of our people who are still stubbornly refusing to turn aside and to detach themselves from it will find themselves swept up, really, in that overall judgment, is the danger of where it can actually go to. So that's all I'm going to say, really, for this particular segment on MAGA, or the MAGA agenda, Make America Great Again. As we know, that we had unofficial title for the podcast we did on it was also Make Europe Great Again, because as you say, it also occurred in Europe as well in the late 15th century. So that's all I'm going to add for this particular segment. So we'll come on to look at other segments, also look at more of the history also around the actual creation of that letter as well, and what transpired really around it all. So this is Anne Samuels. So remember, we are the repairers of the breach as per Isaiah 58:12. Hashtag, we'll restore his paths. To God be the glory. Bye for now.